everybody. Welcome to this week's Eco Talk. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Martha Weiss from the biology department, where she's been here at Georgetown for 30 years. Martha studies plant-insect interactions and has published extensively on cicadas. So I'm really excited to hear some of her cicada work today. So let's give a round of applause.
All right, well, thanks to Earth Commons for inviting me down. I'm excited to talk to everybody about the subject that has been my main scientific preoccupation for the last 6 or 7 years. And before I even get started, I want to acknowledge my terrific team that I've been working with. On the bottom right there is John Lill, who is my main collaborator. He's at George Washington University, and we've worked together on cicadas and a bunch of other topics for many years, and he's the world's greatest collaborator, and everything is fun when we work together. And then we've had a really great team on this project. Zoe Getman-Pickering was our postdoc, and she worked with us for a couple of years. Sarah was an undergraduate of John's at GW, who is really an unbelievable biologist and is heading into graduate school. Grace was an undergraduate at the University of Maryland, and she's now a graduate student in Florida. Dan Gruner is a professor at Maryland, and Sean Menke is our collaborator on ants in Chicago. And so we really had a great team, and it's made everything really fun to work together on. Okay, so here's the big picture. I'm going to start out giving you a little ecological background, which you guys don't really need, but we'll do it anyway. We'll talk a little bit about resource pulses, introduce the main character, which is periodical cicadas, and then put resources together with trophic cascades, tell you about the main findings of our study, and conjecture a little bit about some of the consequences of the ecological patterns that we're finding. Then I'm going to just take a couple minutes to tell you about the current research that we're doing on ants and cicadas, a little bit about the outreach that we've done with cicadas, and then if I get there, I want to take 5 minutes at the end to tell you about our current project, another current project that we're pretty excited about. Okay, so resource pulses are the conceptual backdrop to this whole project. And resource pulses are big, infrequent, short duration influxes of resources into a community. And there's 2 main kinds of resource pulses. One of them is the unpredictable, stochastic type of resource pulse. A whale dies and falls to the bottom of the ocean. A big rainstorm washes the fertilizer off of the golf course. A sewage pipe breaks and dumps hundreds of millions of gallons of raw sewage into the Potomac. These are all unpredictable resource pulses that organisms hopefully can take advantage of. But the other kind of resource pulse is more evolved, and it's a life history phenomenon that is a characteristic of a lot of different kinds of organisms. So acorns that mast, oak trees that mast and produce acorns in huge numbers every 4 or 5 years, or the spawning of salmon in inland waters, or the egg laying of the horseshoe crabs in the Chesapeake Bay are resource pulses that are coordinated. And the main idea for many of these resource pulses is to avoid being wiped out by predators. So predator satiation, having a huge amount of resources concentrated at one time so that predators can eat some of them but won't eat all of them, has selected for a lot of these kinds of resource pulses. So periodical cicadas, Magicicada species, fall squarely into this second type of resource pulse. They're highly predictable. They are a gigantic resource, and presumably their coordination and mass emergence helps them to avoid getting eaten by the predators that find them very tasty. I hope that some or all of you have experienced a periodical cicada emergence. Our last one here was in 2020, right?
About that, yeah.
And 2021. And my first one was in 2004. I'm from California, where cicadas are not. And so I was delighted and flabbergasted to experience my first cicada emergence in 2004. And I thought, if I'm still here 17 long years from now, which seemed highly unlikely, I want to do something with these cicadas. And lo and behold, I was, and I did. Okay, so periodical cicadas, as I mentioned, are an eastern phenomenon. They're basically east of the Mississippi River. They go up. You can see on the map where they are. And each of those colors is a different brood of cicadas. So a brood is simply a bunch of cicadas that comes out at the same time in the same year. They are not all the same species. There are actually 7 different species of periodical cicadas. And in a brood, you can have 2 or up to 7 of these different species coming out at once. And the cicadas that we experience here are brood 10. They are the yellow ones. And they were here in 2021. Okay. Okay, so I want to quickly go through the life history of the life cycle of the cicada so you can see where we're looking, what we're looking at here. And we'll start underground. So the cicadas spend most of their time underground. That little shrimpy looking guy down on the bottom left is a nymph, and it is the sexually immature growth phase of the cicada. Those guys live underground and they have a beak like a hypodermic needle that is plugged into the root of a tree. And they drink the xylem fluid from the roots of the tree. And xylem fluid is a pretty crappy food. It's mostly water with a little bit of minerals, a tiny bit of sugar, a little bit of amino acids in it, but it's a poor food. But the cicadas are able to live on it because they have endosymbiotic bacteria that live in special cells in their guts or in their fat body. And these endosymbiotic bacteria make the amino acids and other things that they really need to be able to grow and develop. And these endosymbionts are so important that every egg that a female cicada lays has a little packet of bacteria in it. And if an egg somehow missed the packet distribution, those babies won't survive because you have to have the endosymbiotic bacteria for the whole thing to work. Okay, so after 17 years, our hero in the spring, on a warm evening when the ground temperature is 64 degrees at 6 to 8 inches below the surface, will crawl up and out. And starting about a month early, it will have made a tunnel from its little underground cell up to the surface so that it's kind of on the runway and it's waiting for that temperature to happen. And I should mention that there's literally billions of cicadas underground. Everybody is by themselves. They're not having a party under there. Everybody is in their own little cell with their own little mud wall, with their own little beaks stuck into their root. No chatting, no water cooler conversation, no nothing. Everybody is on their own. And then when the signal arrives and the temperature warms up, they crawl up and reach the surface. And this usually happens just after sunset on a warm evening, usually here in May. And what you'll see is 1 million cicadas. And when I say 1 million, I am prone to exaggeration. I'm not exaggerating. Millions and millions of cicadas up and heading for a vertical surface where they need to reach to be able to molt into the adult. So our cicada has found a tree, it's climbed up the tree, and then it does this highly choreographed acrobatic activity to get, for the nymph to get out of its nymphal case and molt into an adult. So it's in the diving board position here, and then it does a mighty sit-up and pulls its rear end out of its nymphal case, spreads its wings, and its wings will harden and dry, and the whole thing will get darker, and a day or two later, they are ready for their big job, which is to mate. So the racket that we hear is from the males that are congregating in trees and chorusing and making attractive sounds to bring the females in, and the females will assess the males based on their call and whatever else the females are looking for in the males. They'll mate with them, and then the females will lay eggs. Our female up in the top of the branch on the right is using her long, stiff ovipositor to lay up to about 500 eggs in little slits in the tree. Meanwhile, dad dies, mom dies, 6 weeks pass, the eggs develop in these little slits in the tree, and then these little tiny baby cicadas that are smaller than ants and white hatch out, and they run around on the branch for a little while, and then they jump off and they float like snowflakes down to the ground, where ants are waiting for them with their open jaws, and lots of other hazards await. But they quickly have to get underground and find a root to plug into so that they can start feeding. And over the course of the next few months, they'll burrow down another foot to 18 inches and find a tree root to plug into. And we don't know a heck of a lot about exactly what happens underground because it's underground and it's hard to see, but we think that they do not move much from the tree that they started out on. We don't know a lot about what happens if their tree dies, but there's probably a little bit of movement underground, but not a heck of a lot. Anyway, they're there for 17 years, and then the spring of their 17th year, they make their tunnel and are ready to go. Okay. So you're probably wondering right now how the heck they can tell when 17 years have gone by. And that is an excellent question that we don't really know the answer to. We know that they count an interesting biological phenomenon, but we don't know how they keep track of it. So these guys mostly live on deciduous trees. Remember, in their beak is plugged into the roots of the trees, and these trees leaf out. And when they leaf out, they start pulling water up from the soil, through the roots, up the trunk of the tree, and out the leaves through this transpiration stream. And what is thought is that the cicadas keep track of the pulse, the movement of the annual movement of the water through the xylem. And Rick Carbon did a really cool experiment to test this, and he took some trees that had some 16-year cicadas that he knew had been around for 16 years underneath them, and he artificially defoliated the trees. So they leafed out, and then I guess this would have been in the 15th year. They leafed out, and then he cut all the leaves off, and the leaves came back again, and those cicadas came out a year early because they counted each of those leafing out and associated movement of xylem sap as a separate year. Where they put the little marks on the wall of their cell, we don't know, but we think that it's some kind of modification of gene expression, and people are working on that. Okay, so who eats cicadas? The answer to that is pretty much everybody. Fish and birds and possums and squirrels. And my dog here is representing other dogs, but my dog does not eat cicadas. But pretty much anybody that's a generalist predator, and even specialists will eat the cicadas. And just to come back to this idea of predator satiation, this is a figure from an important paper that Kathy Williams wrote in a long time ago. And basically what it shows is, let me explain the axes. The gray bars on the right are percent of predation. So those gray towers are how much is getting eaten. The y-axis on the other side is a measure of the density of cicadas. And what we can see is when the cicadas are first coming out at the very beginning of the year, when the numbers are very low, 100% of them are getting eaten because the skyscrapers are all the way up to the top. Every single one of those little guys is getting eaten. But then as the cicada numbers skyrocket, the predators can't keep up. And so a lot of the cicadas are getting eaten, but way more of them are surviving. And so that white area over the gray bars in the middle there, that represents the beauty of predator satiation, that those guys are all able to stay alive. And then you can see as the population declines, that predation is able to keep up again. And by the very end, when we have very few cicadas left, those guys are goners. So it's bad to be at the very beginning, it's bad to be at the very end, but the guys in the middle do pretty well. Okay. So the next little bit of ecology that we need to talk about is a trophic cascade. And trophic cascades are indirect interactions that can have cascading impacts through the entire ecosystem. So when a predator eats an herbivore or another organism, then it limits the density and or the behavior of that herbivore, and therefore helps out the trophic level that herbivore eats. So for example, our bird up here eats the caterpillars eats the leaves, and so the bluebird is doing the oak tree a favor indirectly by keeping the caterpillar numbers down. And people often get confused about this. I'll just mention that those arrows are the direction of energy flow. It's not that the leaves are eating the caterpillars. It's that the caterpillars are getting energy from the leaves and the birds are getting energy from the caterpillars. So studies where people put big tents or nets over trees and keep birds away demonstrate that insectivorous birds are really important at keeping caterpillar numbers down. And they, so if we get rid of the birds, we could presume that the caterpillar numbers are going to increase. And a study a few years ago in this area demonstrated that to fledge a single brood of chickadees, a nesting pair has to catch between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars. So if the birds are not eating caterpillars, that's going to be a big hit for the trees. Okay, so here's our question. If we add a few billion cicadas to the mix, and they are accessible, undefended, I need to mention that cicadas are basically flying hot dogs. They are not toxic, they're not spiny, they're slow, they're easy pickings. If we add a few billion cicadas to the mix, and if the birds switch over to feeding on the cicadas, does this give the caterpillars a break, and do the trees then suffer the consequences? So that's our big question. What are the ecological consequences of a massive pulse of insect biomass for the surrounding ecological community? And what we hypothesized is that the birds that ordinarily make their living eating caterpillars are going to say this is too much effort, and they'll just eat cicadas that are dropping on their head everywhere. I will admit that I was sort of the team skeptic here. I was worried that delicate little warblers that like to have a little tasty, soft caterpillar morsel would turn up their little beaks at cicadas and say, forget it, I'm not going to eat those big, tough, crunchy things, and none of this would work. But happily, spoiler alert, I was wrong. So we did this work at 2 different field sites in Maryland, one at the Isaac Walton League in Poolsville, Maryland, which is a big area of land where a lot of the Isaac Walton people are very interested in conservation, but they're also hunters. So they hunt the heck out of the deer, which is very handy because the oak seedlings that ordinarily get totally mown down by deer in Rock Creek and in our other parks, there are oak seedlings out there so that we could use small trees that we could bend over and be able to see every single leaf. And then we also worked out at the Smithsonian facility out in Edgewater, Maryland. Okay, and the first part of our study was to look to see if the birds were actually eating the cicadas. And so we had a bird team that got up at 5 o'clock every morning and went out and with their binoculars and looked at birds to see what they were eating. And then we also enlisted a bunch of citizen science volunteers to record observations for us. And we got a lot of data from our own team and from our citizen scientists. And it turns out that this round phylogeny shows all of the birds in Maryland. And the pink lines are the birds that we saw, that we had reports of eating cicadas or that we saw eating cicadas. And this is an underrepresentation of who's actually eating cicadas, but it was a heck of a lot of birds, ranging from little tiny bush tits up to gigantic herons and hawks and everybody in between. And they were water birds and passerine birds, and basically everybody was all in on the cicadas. And we found all kinds of interesting behavior. At first, we had thought that the little guys weren't going to be able to eat the cicadas, but it turned out that there was all kinds of creative cicada eating behaviors that we saw. So some birds just swallowed the whole thing whole. Others took their beaks and slid open the tummies and just took the soft part in the abdomen out. Others took them and smashed them against rocks or stuck them underwater. There was a lot of interesting behaviors that went with the feeding. But the main thing to see is that everybody's all in on this giant resource pulse. Looking across the 6 weeks of the emergence, on the y-axis here, we're looking at the proportion of all of the food that we saw these birds eating with our binoculars, and how much of it was cicadas. And basically over 50% of the food that people saw the birds taking back to the nest was cicadas. And let me just remind you that ordinarily, every 16 out of 17 years, there aren't any cicadas around. These guys are not used to eating cicadas at this time of year. And so this is a novel prey for everybody, and everybody's all in on the cicadas. And the other thing to notice is that it didn't matter what the diet of the birds was. The insectivores, maybe not so surprising that they ate the cicadas, but the seed eaters ate cicadas, the omnivores ate the cicadas, everybody ate the cicadas. And Grace Soltis, who was an undergraduate at University of Maryland, did her senior honors thesis on this project, and she did a really lovely job analyzing the diversity of birds that were taking the cicadas and some of the behaviors that went with how they managed to eat them. Okay, so bird foraging conclusions. We found that many, if not most, of the local birds altered their diets and ate cicadas when they were just everywhere. Some birds had to learn how to process the cicadas, so they started out a little bulky but got better over time. And we also found that because the cicadas congregate on the edge of the forest, the birds also changed their foraging locations and went to the edges of the forest to find the cicadas. So they moved from the interior to the forest edges. Okay, so part one, birds eat cicadas. Our next question was to see how important bird predation was in the field. And this is where I was thinking maybe these little birds aren't going to go for it, even though we saw that some of them were doing that. So to be able to get at this question, we made fake clay caterpillars and we glued our caterpillars onto trees. Every Tuesday, we would go out to our forest and glue 80 caterpillars onto our trees. And then we would come back the next week and look at the caterpillars and see if we could see evidence of predation. And this is my collaborator, John. And just to show you what we're looking at, on the left is a bona fide caterpillar, and on the right is one of our nice fake caterpillars that has had a run-in with a frustrated bird that has tried it a few times and has found that it is not as delicious as it looked. So the evidence of predation is pretty obvious on our clay caterpillars, which are glued onto the trees. So just to show you, everybody really likes these, or at least gives these clay caterpillars a try. They were complimenting our efforts at making plausible fake caterpillars. So what we found, and this is the $1 million result, is that over 3 years, we looked at the bird predation on the caterpillars. And so in 2020, up at the top, you can see, and that is the year before the cicadas came out, about 35% of our caterpillars had beak marks in them. And that stayed pretty constant across the entire semester, the entire period. So we would glue our caterpillars onto the branches 1 week, come back the next week, and then assess the caterpillars to see whether they had bird damage. So 2020, about 35% of our caterpillars had damage in them. The purple line is 2021, the cicada emergence year, and we started putting our caterpillars out in the first week of May before the cicadas emerged. And what we saw, let's see. See this thing? Yeah. Early on in May, we saw about 25 or 30% of our caterpillars had marks in them. And then as the cicadas showed up, and here you can see that at first the nymphs were around, and then the cicadas molted into adults. As the cicadas showed up, the proportion of caterpillars in the trees that had bird damage plummeted. The proportion of fake caterpillars in the trees that had bird damage plummeted. And so we went from around 25% down to less than 10% for the whole time that the cicadas were out. And basically the birds walked off the job, they stopped eating the cicadas. And after we saw the last adults cicadas in the last week of June, and starting soon thereafter, predation on our clay caterpillars came back up again. So you can see in the cicada year that we had a precipitous and persistent drop while the cicadas were around, because the birds basically ignored our fake caterpillars. And then by the end of the summer, we were back up to normal levels. Then we went and did this whole process again the next year, and we were back to normal. The caterpillars, our clay caterpillars, received about the same level of damage as they had the year before. So what we can see here is that the birds really are ditching their ordinary food, the caterpillars, and moving over to the cicadas and giving the caterpillars a little bit of an ecological break.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Unlike what we do in biology, which is interrupt the speaker constantly, I thought that would make you feel at home. It strikes me, something you said, the birds presumably did not experience the previous emergence,
Not just
right?
presumably, absolutely.
Absolutely.
They're not
So,
17 years
so
old.
how do they know that the cicadas are good to eat?
They try them.
They try them without,
They experiment.
okay. Okay.
And they're everywhere. And so a lot of these birds, and these are, some of these are frugivores and seed eaters, but they're just all over the place and they just try them. Okay, so we've figured out that the birds are eating the cicadas, and now we want to know if that's going to impact what's happening with the caterpillars. So we censused our caterpillars quantitatively for all of these years as well. And we looked to see who was around before, during, and after the cicada emergence. And if you've ever gone wandering in the Maryland woods and looked closely at the oak trees, you'll see that there's a really stunning variety of caterpillars out there. And so what we did was go out and look at caterpillars on the trees in May and June. And we looked at the density of caterpillars in the understory. And so first I want you to look at May 2021. The last graph that I showed you with the caterpillar predation was 2020, 21, and 2022. But because of the restrictions during the pandemic in 2020, we couldn't get as much of the work done that we wanted to in that first COVID world shutdown year. So instead of doing the year before, the year of, and the year after, we looked at caterpillar densities in the year of and 2 years after. And so first I want you to look in May before the cicadas come out, and you can see that the densities of free feeding caterpillars on the trees are about the same for those 3 years. And then if we look in June, which is peak cicada time, you can see that the caterpillar abundance more than doubles in the cicada year and then goes back to ordinary levels, a little bit of elevated from ordinary levels, but goes way back in the next couple of years. And if we look at one of the most common caterpillars, we can really see some striking patterns. So this is Acronicta increta, and you can see in that picture above a big brown pretzel. That's a fourth or fifth instar caterpillar, a pretty mature caterpillar, but that little backwards comma down below, if you squint, you can see that that's a first or a second instar caterpillar. That's a young caterpillar that's going to grow up into that brown thing. And during the cicada year, 2021, half of the caterpillars we saw were these little guys, and half of them were the big brown donuts, which is really unusual. If you look at 2022 and 2023, almost all of those caterpillars that we found were the tiny size guys. We rarely saw you rarely see the big caterpillars during a non-cicada year because birds are out eating them. So when the birds had moved off the job and were eating cicadas instead of caterpillars, the demography of the caterpillars totally changed from just little guys being around to really big honker caterpillars being around as well. And you can see that the abundance of the caterpillars on the right-hand side. that we had lots of acronicta in 2021 and half as much in 2022 and 2023. So not only the numbers, but the sizes of the caterpillars were different when the birds were not eating the caterpillars. Okay, so we know that the birds are eating the caterpillars, or that the birds are eating the cicadas so that they stop eating the caterpillars. We know that the caterpillar numbers are changing. And so now what's happening with the caterpillars on the oak trees? The caterpillar's big job is to eat oak leaves. And so let's see if we can see this impact moving down one trophic level to the oak trees. And to do this, we used a really great program that our postdoc, Zoe Gettin-Pickering, was one of the authors of, called Leaf Bite. And it is a way of quantifying herbivory on the leaf. You can look at how much leaf damage has been taken out of a leaf. And it really has been a great tool to use for people who study herbivory. And here on the y-axis, we're looking at the median accumulated herbivory, how much of the leaf has been taken away by a caterpillar or by some other leaf chewer. And you can see that in 2021, the herbivory numbers are about twice as high as in the years on either side. So during the cicada emergence year, not only are there a heck of a lot more caterpillars, the caterpillars are bigger, but they are also doing what we would expect them to do and eating the leaves. Okay, so putting the picture together, the cicadas show up, the birds are eating the caterpillars. Because they're eating the caterpillars, the birds are neglecting, the birds are eating the cicadas. Because they're eating the cicadas, they're neglecting the caterpillars. The caterpillar numbers are growing and the caterpillars themselves are growing, and they're doing a lot more damage on the trees. Okay, so to generalize the response, what we're seeing is that in a non-emergence year, the birds are eating the caterpillars, and by eating the caterpillars, they're doing the oaks a favor. So there's an indirect positive relationship between the birds and the oaks. In a non-emergence, that's in a non-emergence year. In an emergence year, we add the cicadas to the story, and the birds are eating the cicadas. So the caterpillars are getting a break, and the oak and the trees are getting hammered. So this is a relationship called apparent facilitation. We often talk in ecology about apparent competition, where different organisms are competing via a third party. And we can see the same thing, although it has been demonstrated less frequently with apparent facilitation, where the caterpillars are benefiting from the presence of the cicadas because the birds are eating the cicadas instead of the caterpillars. So this is a nice example of apparent facilitation that happens just during the emergence years. Okay, so we looked mostly, we focused our study in these oak trees, but all of these cicadas were showing up across the whole landscape. And so we wanted to see if there were impacts in other habitats as well. And so John had a student at GW who was studying row crops and the caterpillars that were eating row crops. And she saw, this is Ryan Spahn, and she saw a more than threefold increase in P. rapi caterpillar abundance on the brassicas, the Brussels sprouts and the broccolis and the cauliflowers in the field compared to the previous years. And presumably the birds that were ordinarily keeping the caterpillars down that were foraging in the fields and usually eating the caterpillars, were eating cicadas instead. And so predation or herbivory by the caterpillars exploded on the row crops. And we saw the same kinds of things with tent caterpillars in the trees, where the year before, when the cicadas were out, the birds that ordinarily eat the tent caterpillars didn't eat the tent caterpillars. So we got an explosion of tent caterpillars that defoliated the trees the following year. So there are a lot of sort of knock-on effects that happen when the birds basically walk off the job, stop eating the caterpillars that they ordinarily eat. And then there are consequences for the things that the caterpillars who are left to explode do eat. One thing that is really interesting is that the cicada emergences set the timing of acorn masting events. So you guys are probably familiar with the fact that our oak trees make a few acorns, a reasonable number of acorns a year, but every 3 or 4 or 5 years, they make a gigantic number of acorns, and they're raining down on and landing on your cars and everywhere. And they're basically trying to satiate the predators that are going to be eating all of those acorns. And they're getting a jump on the acorns are going to get ahead those years. But what we found, or not what we found, but what Walt Koenig and other collaborators found is that periodical cicada emergences are altering the masting behavior of oak trees. And so when the cicadas come out, the oak trees basically have gotten, they're dialing back the effort that they're putting in on making acorns, because they've gotten a lot more herbivory damage from the caterpillars that aren't getting eaten. And so the year of the emergence, they don't make many acorns. The next year, they don't make many acorns. And then the year after that, they have a big explosion of acorns. So the cicadas are basically setting the timing for the masting events of the oaks. And then they'll play out on the oak's own time every 3 or 4 years until the next cicada emergence, which is kind of cool. Okay, so this is all sort of interesting because we live in a cicada area, but why else is this relevant? And again, you can admire our map and see that we're not going to be getting our cicadas again until 2038, but we can travel to see cicadas. Well, one reason why this is interesting is because predator satiation, this whole process that we are talking about, the production of a surfeit of food that will satiate the predators so that the ones that are left behind can escape, it's pretty common in a variety of different ecosystems. And what people tend to look at is the guys that are getting eaten. But what this our study shows us is that what's also really interesting to look at is the ones that are not getting eaten, and what is escaping when there's another prey that has kicked in and is taking the brunt of the damage. So when the I'll skip these specific examples, but when there is a huge amount of something showing up and the predators are focusing on that, and we need to look at what is being, what's happening in what's being left behind. And so as everybody is aware of, we've had a tremendous decline in our birds in Eastern North America. Almost all of the different types of species and types of habitats have lost large proportions of birds. And what our cicada study gives us a little sneak preview of is what would happen if the birds were not doing the job that they ordinarily are doing, right? So with our cicada study, the birds that are usually eating the caterpillars are not eating the caterpillars anymore. And so we're taking them out of the equation temporarily. And so that can give us a little bit of a sneak preview of what's going to happen if the birds disappear for another reason. I think I didn't explain that all too well. You get what I'm talking about there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
All right. So I'm moving on from this project to our current project, and I have no idea what time it is. 3. Okay. The project that we're working on now is similar, but we're looking at ants, and we're seeing how cicada emergences affect ants. And you might think, why the heck should ants care about cicadas? They're, birds I get, but what's going on with ants? But it turns out that ants are very involved in the whole cicada process as well. And I just want to show you some stages of the cicadas that you might not have seen. In the far left are eggs that are tucked into the egg nests on a tree. And then we see the little babies that are running around. They've just hatched out and they're running around on the twig. And those are the ones that jump off and land on the ground and burrow underneath. And my graduate students taking a look at these babies, and we're tracking them in the field. It turns out that baby cicadas, the rainfall of baby cicadas is a tremendous resource for ants that are standing by practically with their jaws open, waiting for the baby cicadas to drop down. And they're undefended and edible. And so the ants are grabbing a ton of them. It's a race between the cicadas and the ants, and the cicadas are trying to burrow quickly underground to go find a twig to plug in on. And the ants are prowling, trying to get them. So what we were interested in seeing is how this big resource pulse for the ants changes the jobs that they ordinarily do, because ants are sort of the unsung heroes of a lot of our ecosystems, and they do a ton of jobs that we don't usually give them credit for. So what happens if the ants walk off their jobs? There's a lot of ecosystem services that they carry out for us. They disperse seeds, and there's a lot of seeds that have special little structures on them that are designed for ants to take, and so that the ants will disperse the seeds. They monitor extrafloral nectaries. So plants basically have little soda fountains on their stems to pay ants to patrol the stems, so that if they see a caterpillar, they can get rid of the caterpillar. They tend aphids and other insects to protect them, so that the ants can milk those insects and get sugar water from them. And so we wanted to see what would happen when the cicadas show up and the ants have a big fat distraction that's keeping them from all of these other jobs. And I think I put these in the wrong order. We were happy that our cicada study ended up in Science, and we ended up communicating with a lot of people who were working in cicadas in different places around this. Okay. So we're working on the ant project now, and we're on our 4th year of an NSF grant for the ant project, and we're finding that the presence of the cicadas impacts the ants in a lot of interesting ways, and that the ants basically do stop doing a lot of the jobs that they otherwise would be doing. They're not dispersing seeds as much as they would be dispersing seeds. They're not collecting dead insects as much as they would be collecting dead insects. They're not protecting aphids and getting their colonies going in the same way that they otherwise would be doing, so that there are big impacts from the cicada emergences on ants as well. Okay, So the last thing that I'm going to tell you in the last couple of minutes is a project that we have been working on for the last couple of years that is just been accepted to a journal and is coming out soon, and we're excited about it. And this is a question of how the cicada nymphs, when they come up at night from their little trees, when it gets to be 64 degrees, how do they find the trees that they have to get to? And this is something that people have noted for 150 years, but because the emergence happens so quickly, they come up one night and they're basically, they have a few hours to find a tree or all is lost. People haven't spent much time studying this phase of the life cycle. So Allard in 1937 speculated on this. There's other speculations from the 1860s and 70s, but Allard says he's noticing all of these cicada nymphs coming up, and he says at the beginning of the emergence, while there was still weak light, it might be surmised that a sense of vision guided the cicadas, but long after darkness had set in, the same unerring directive behavior continued to manifest itself. It is hard to see how ordinary vision can operate in darkness, but of course there are other waves than the visible light emanating from the trees. So he had a little sort of mystical idea of what might be happening. So we also noted starting a long time ago, for my first cicada emergence, we noted basically hordes of cicadas marching down the sidewalk toward the trees and not knowing how they might do that. And I tried to study it in 2021, but by the time we figured out this was something that we wanted to look at, the nymphs were gone. And so because the emergences happen so quickly, you really have to be right on top of what you're asking. So I thought about it again in 2021, and then in 2024, we went to Chicago to study a cicada emergence, because if you stay in one place, you are limited to looking at your cicadas every 17 years. But we finally figured out that we could be like deadheads and follow the band. And so we went to Chicago for the emergence in 2024. And this was when we finally were able to look at this question. And a colleague who came to visit us in Chicago, when I was talking to him about this, he said, look at Strong and Ray, 1975, which we looked up. And this is a paper about how the seeds of Monstera deliciosa, your favorite dentist office houseplant, how they find a tree to climb up. And so these trees make these big fruits way the heck up in the tree. The fruits drop. They're like bigger than a corn cob. They drop down onto the forest floor. And to be able to make a flower again, the seed has to get from the middle of the forest floor to the tree. It has to climb up the tree, climb out to a sunny spot where it can get enough photosynthate to make flowers and fruits, and then make its fruit and drop it down again. So how the heck do the seeds get to the tree? So these guys, Strong and Ray, figured out that the seeds do something interesting that people hadn't thought about seeds doing, which is that they grow toward darkness. And they named this phenomenon scototropism. Scoto means darkness or shade, so they grow toward darkness or shade. So I read this paper and a light went off in my head, and I thought, okay, this is exactly what these cicadas are doing, except instead of growing toward darkness, they are walking toward darkness. So I thought, if it's called scototropism in plants, then it would be called scototaxis in animals. So I Googled scototaxis, and lo and behold, I'd never heard of this term before, but I found 2 or 3 papers from a few decades ago about animals walking toward darkness, mostly forest-dwelling bugs, but also ants that fall into the water and arboreal ants that fall into a puddle and need to get out of the puddle. They swim towards a dark object that is coming out of the puddle. So it was in the literature, subtle, but in the literature, that there's this movement toward darkness, not away from light, but toward darkness. So we started looking at our cicadas and tracking where they went when they first came up from underground. And so you can see from the starting point on the right, those cicadas made a beeline for the tree. And the yellow, the orangey yellow line is the direct path that they took. No, is the traveled, the pink line is where they traveled. The yellow orange line is the most direct way. And those guys wasted not 1% of effort in getting directly to the tree. On the left, you can see that the cicada that followed the pink path went a little bit further than it needed to, but not much. So they are heading toward tree trunks or other dark emergent objects. And to test whether this was vision or not, we temporarily painted over the eyes of the cicadas to see where they would go if they couldn't see. And so on the top, the yellow line represents a cicada that did not have its eyes painted. And the one on the right, that guy had his eyes painted and he went on a random walk for 10 minutes until we called it. And then to make everybody feel not bad about this, I want to reassure you that we took the cicadas and we put them up in a primo location on the tree where they were able to molt, and happily sight was restored, and they were in an even better place than they needed to be. But I just want to call your attention to the picture on the right. That is what the tree looks like that's at midnight outside of Chicago. And even in the darkness, a solid dark object is a target. So we did this for a whole bunch of cicadas, and we got this nice bicycle wheel chart where from whatever direction the cicadas were marching directly toward the tree. And that is how, mystery solved, that's how they get there. We finally did one more experiment inside to make sure that other waves were not involved. And we did this in our living room, and we put cicadas in the middle of the floor, and we had a dark target and a light target. And of the cicadas that got out of the buffer zone, 28 of them moved to the dark target and 4 of them moved to the light target. So we're pretty convinced that they are walking toward darkness to get to where they need to go. And what is really my favorite thing about this study is that the cicadas and the monstera seedlings are doing exactly the same thing. And so on the right-hand side, we have a monstera fruit dropping to the ground, the seeds using positive scototropism to grow toward the tree. Then at the same time as the cicadas are using positive scototaxis to walk toward the tree, then when they get there, they both ditch the darkness and they grow or crawl against gravity, demonstrating either negative geotaxis or negative geotropism until they get high enough, and then they ditch the gravity part and they go back to light, but this time they're growing toward light or walking toward light. And so both of these groups of organisms in the same habitat, bound by the same physical laws, are using the same sets of behaviors in the same order to get the same job done, which I think is pretty cool. And with that, I'm all done. I just want to point out on the right-hand side, that is something you will never see in nature. That's a first instar nymph, possibly on its mother's head, so that you can see how little they are and how much they grow over the course of 17 years. And I've blasted through a bunch of stuff, so appreciate your patience and happy to answer any questions.
The cicada eggs seem like that ants could get to those relatively easily as well. Do they just like the juicier nymphs after they emerge?
That's a great question. There are some ants that will go and look for the eggs, but they're in a slit and the tree kind of, the slit kind of closes over the eggs a little bit so that they're not just hanging out completely available. So there are some ants that will, and the way that the tissue responds on different trees differs. So some of them will close it in a little bit more and some of them it's a little bit more open. But it's not that easy for the ants to get them because they dig them in pretty deep.
Well, fascinating. Thank you so much. It was so interesting. When you mentioned nymphs and molting, how do you know 4 times? If they're 17 years and they're sort of stuck into the roots, feeding, how do you know it's 4 times that they're molting?
So
Why not 6?
people dig them up and you can look and see, and they move in discrete size increments. So the first instars are 4 millimeters long and the second instars are, making this up, 8 millimeters long and the third instars are 14 millimeters long. So you can see the discrete size classes and you can know that they have that many molts before they will emerge. There's been a recent really interesting study that has shown that if they get that the cicada stuff happens in 4-year intervals.
Yeah.
And if they get to just before, so there are 17-year cicadas and there's 13-year cicadas. The 13-year cicadas evolved from the 17-year cicadas and they're in the south and they grow more quickly. So if they get to a certain size threshold, by the time that 13 years rolls around, they'll come out. If they show up, if they don't get there by 13 years, then they have to wait. They would be ready to go at 14, but no, they have to wait for 4 years. So that's thought to be a way to make sure that there's a big enough critical mass that they're able to overwhelm their predators, satiate their predators. Because if some small proportion came out every year, then the predators will be able to completely keep up with them. So the 4-year thing is kind of cool. Cindy?
Hi. Yeah, I was just curious about the annual cicadas and whether they have a resource pulse as big as the periodical cicadas, or how they, if you've also looked at the same
We
things.
haven't looked at the annual cicadas, but there aren't as many of them. And they're evolved to, because they don't have they don't do the whole predator satiation thing there. You don't see them as often. And so they use other means to not get eaten.
Got it. And then a related question is, I know that sometimes you have multiple brood, very rarely, multiple, like the 13-year and the 17-year cicadas coming out all
Which is
at
what we
once.
had in Chicago.
Right.
Yeah. They didn't overlap. They were.
Adjacent. Oh, got it.
Yeah.
Really fascinating. It's not my area of research at all, but I enjoyed the talk. I was wondering about this experiment that was done where the tree was defoliated and then a small group, I assume, came out. I'm guessing we aren't at the point where we know if that changed their entire cycle so that they come out a year early every time.
Well, so people are looking at that to sort of model the evolution of the 13 years from the 17 years.
Right.
And it seems like there probably are some offset emergences, but if there's not a ton of them that come out early, they'll
Right.
get hammered.
Right.
And so the predators will take care of them and that will take care of that rogue group.
With a massive sort of climatic event or changes, you might expect.
We're actually expecting that the 13 years, that there'll be enough, people are predicting that with warming climates, that there'll be enough 13 years cicadas to come out that they will be able to not all get eaten, and that we could actually start getting more 13-year broods further north. But people are modeling that out.
I think we do one more quick question.
Is there any like record of how long periodic
cicadas or other insects have been around,
Been around in.
like deep
The
time,
fossil
like,
record.
yeah. How would you look for that?
I don't know if there are great cicada fossils. I mean, certainly there's records in human history for a long time. I don't know about the fossil records of periodical cicadas. I haven't run into anything about that. That's an interesting question.